Almost had it. It was like so close. I just want to remind everybody that if you're not on the email list, if you heard about the meeting from a friend or something, you can sign up at the Miami Pioneers and Natives of Dade website, and it's the letters MPNOD.org. And just sign up for the email list there. And while you're there, there's a membership page, and you can sign up as a member. Okay. And if you'd like an application before you leave, Marlene, right here, Marlene. Say hi. Yeah, we can. That's it. Marlene has membership applications, and they don't really hurt very much. Okay, very good. Bob Carr, are you ready? Come on up here.
Well, this is another great moment of being able to share, and I'm glad you're all here with an interest in archaeology. Many of you might have heard some of my stories before. For those, forgive me for what might be repetition. I grew up in Miami, like some of you, and I wasn't born here. My father is from Rochester, New York, and my mother's from Philadelphia. And they decided that they were heading south. This is after World War II, several years after. And you know, it's always interesting to uncover the genealogy of your family, but I would really like uncovering the motivations of my family. I think that's far more interesting. So I said to my dad, I said, well, what brought you down here? I mean, well, he said, you know, it's warmer in New York, and there's job opportunities. They're doing a lot of building in South Florida. And, you know, and he said, I just saw that movie, Key Largo, and I really liked that movie. And so, you know, the first place we ended up was in Key Largo. And what was exciting for me as a 6-year-old boy was that coming out of the cold brown bricks of South Philadelphia, South Philly, as they say, and then suddenly in this amazing tropical wonderland, and my father, a clever guy that he was, he decided, because we didn't have any money, that the best thing he could do was to buy an old Miami-Dade County school bus at an auction. And he bought a bus for $50. He refitted it into a little, like a house, like a trailer house. And he literally drove it. He drove it to Key Largo. And I was so excited. It was me and my sister, and I had a bunk bed in the very back of the bus. Oh. And every morning, my mother would open up, you know, those accordion doors in the front, open up the door, and there'd be this giant golden orb spider that had spun the web. And my mother would scream every morning as soon as she opened it. And but I was in paradise. And for my mother, though, who had never seen anything green, that tall, those big trees and so forth, it didn't wear well with her. And after a while, we moved up to Miami. Into what is now, well, 79th Street and Victory Gardens. It was a after war housing development, and spent the rest of my young years living in Miami, growing up in Miami. And then by the time I was in middle school, which was, some of you might know, Ada Merritt, I was always a curious kid, always interested in history and in science. And I asked the teacher in 7th grade, her name was Mrs. Murphy, I said, who were the first people in Miami? And she said, well, it was the Seminoles. I said, oh, okay, so the Seminoles, all right. That made sense. I mean, I've seen pictures of them. She had no idea about the Tequesta, the first people. And several weeks later, one of my classmates, and this is a story I've told a lot of times, so you might have heard this, Mark Green, comes into the class with a shoebox, and it's filled with artifacts, with animal bones and pieces of shell, and this beautiful axe made out of basaltic stone, which doesn't occur in South Florida. I said, Mark, where did you find these things? He said, oh, I'm not going to tell you. It's my secret site. I go, well, come on, Mark. I mean, well, it took 3 days worth of lunch money to convince him to share that secret. And so, as it turned out, Mark and I actually became very, very good friends. And we decided we would go to that site together, and there near the bank of the Miami River, Brickell Bridge, which size the river gate was eventually built, and now it's Capitol Grill, 444 Brickell. it was a YMCA ball field, and in the back of the field next to the river, there it was overgrown, and there was a mound. The mound was only about 2.5 feet tall, and it was about 12 feet wide. It was a tiny little mound, and we started digging. Of course, we didn't know better. We obviously didn't know anything about archaeology, and shouldn't really had no real business doing that. But there was nobody to guide us, nobody to say no, and we started finding pieces of animal bones and pottery sherds, and we said, well, we're going to do this right. We want to be good archaeologists. So we had a pad, paper, a notebook. We took notes. We were drawing, and here we were looking at the mound, and we knew that in the center of the mound was the secret. The great treasure was in the center, and we said, well, you know what? We're not going to dig in the center, not yet. No, we're going to start from the edge, like a big pizza pie, kind of slice our way into this. And that's what we did. We started in June, and we went to almost every day. And then we got to the center, near the center, and with our little tools, we heard something we'd never heard before, because, you know, digging into the dirt and you're finding these prehistoric artifacts, everything has a particular sound. You're trying not to break anything. You're trying to be very careful. But we heard something different. We heard the sound of metal scratching metal, and it was our metal tools. We were hitting something made out of metal, and as we started brushing it away, we started seeing iron rust. And I thought, this is really strange. I mean, we know the Iron Age was not part of prehistoric Florida. And as we brushed and brushed and brushed, it became larger and larger, and eventually the treasure, the secret of the mound, was finally uncovered. It was the Model T Ford. So what had happened was the Model T Ford had been scraped out of the river during a cleanup with all the sand and soil and all the artifacts mixed in. So we hadn't damaged the site at all. And we got a great learning experience. And I told my father, I said, Dad, I think I'd like to be an archaeologist. He said, oh, that's a really bad idea. He says, you're not going to make any money. You're not going to get a job. You got to be an engineer. You got to think smart. You got to do the right thing. And, you know, I kind of wavered back and forth and went to school at the University of Miami-Dade, to transfer to Florida State. And, you know, when you're young and you're trying to think about where you want to land, you try a lot of different things. And in the end, I decided that even if there's reincarnation, I was only going to remember one life at a time. So I was going to be an archaeologist. And so my father wasn't happy, but I changed my major to anthropology and archaeology. And eventually, working and living in Tallahassee, I didn't realize I had the absolute best location to get that schooling in Florida, because there, in addition to the university, was the fact that the State Archives Historic Preservation Office was in Tallahassee, and the National Park Service headquarters for all of the southeastern United States was in Tallahassee. So all the kids that I knew who went to Gainesville were essentially unemployed. But all the kids in Tallahassee, almost all the grad students and the undergrads, we all had jobs if we wanted them. They were there. And I worked for the National Park Service, and I worked for the state of Florida. And I got some great experience with that opportunities. And when I was working with the state, I remember applying for the job. And at that time, it was good old boys running the state archives. Women were a scarcity, really. And there were no women archaeologists. That changed dramatically in about 1974, fortunately. And I can tell you, sharing that event was the fact that first I was hired by Ross Morell, and Ross Morell called me into the office. I had applied with two other graduate students for the job of state archaeologists, contract archaeologists for the state. And he said, Bob, I want to tell you, you got the job. I want to tell you why you got the job. And I'm thinking, wow, man, I must be doing something really great. He goes, well, first of all, he says, you can write, and the other two applicants, they don't write too well, and we don't want to fix their writing. I said, okay, well, that's good. He said, but second, and this is what's really important to us, you're from Miami, and none of us ever want to go to Miami. So you're the one, you're going to Miami, and we're going to start you out at Arch Creek. Discovery, got some things to do down there. That's going to be your first job. I said, wow, that's great. I was so excited. And then the other epic event coming to Miami in 1974 was something that all of us, and particularly all of you women, could appreciate. So one of my co-students, Marcia Chance, applies to be an archaeologist, and they turn her down. They tell her, no, we're not going to hire you. We can't hire you. You're a woman. This is rough work. You're out in the field. You know, it's hot. And more importantly, we have our occupancy. All the other teams are 2-people teams. You know, they have to share a hotel room when they're traveling. Well, yeah, we can't have you sharing a room with some guy. We you know, it's just not right. We can't do that. Well, she got an attorney, and she said, well, I'm filing a lawsuit because you're discriminating against me. First female archaeologist to be hired in the state of Florida. Good for her. And I knew her. She was a friend of mine, and she was very smart, very smart. And so I get a call from the same guy, Ross. He says, Bob, he says, I got some bad news for you. I said, what is that? He said, well, this woman's been stirring up a lot of trouble here, and we're going to have to hire her. I have to hire her. I said, that's fine. I said, who is it? I didn't know any of this at the time. He said, oh, it's Marcia Chance. I said, oh, well, I know her from school. She's great. She's smart. He says, well, she's going to be your partner. I'm sorry. Well, Marcia Chance was probably the most beautiful woman in Florida State University. So that was a great distraction in itself, but she was very smart, and we were very good friends. And we ended up working together for 2 years as partners. And she was a very strong personality, as you could guess. And of course, I was in charge of the 2-person team. And after the first assignment, the second one, she says, you know, well, why are you in charge? I said, well, I get because they said I was. No, she said, no, it's my turn. It's my turn. I said, okay, that's fine. I don't mind. I mean, that's fine. So we would take turns rotating.
Is this true?
And one day
You're not making this up, right?
oh, I wish I was. But I'm not. I wish I was that creative. I am though. But so I end up. We're driving to we're in Tampa, driving on a project. We have a state car. I'm driving. Marcia is sitting in the right side of me, passenger, and this car comes up behind us, and so they're honking furiously. Like I said, wow, what's going on? And a car he pulls around us, and he's parallel. I thought it was a cop, but it's some citizen, and he's like signaling us, pull down the window. I put down the window. He said, pull over, pull over. And I pull over, and I'm thinking, what could be wrong? He gets out of the car, and he goes, hey, why are you driving in a state car with your girlfriend? Well, I mean, it's hard to believe these stories today, right? Marcia, the dragon lady, gets out of the car and starts screaming at him. She says, you got a lot of nerve assuming I'm his girlfriend. I work for the state just like him. I'm a state employee. That guy crawled back into his car. You know, those days are over, but I don't think we should forget that they once existed, all of us being where we're at today.
Did you marry Marcia?
Yeah, thank you, Marcia. She doesn't even, you know, I see her all the time, and now she appreciates what she did. She didn't even think about it at the time, what a difference she made. So I'm going to share with you new discoveries. Start out with 10 artifacts to tell the Miami story, but frankly, things have been so tumultuous in the last few weeks that I didn't have time to finish that, but I thought instead I would go over some of what is here. Let me see if I can put this thing. I don't see this working. Oh, am I supposed to point at this? It doesn't work. I'll try it. Is that working? Oh, maybe I was hitting the wrong thing there. Okay. Well, here, I may have to get a slightly different angle so I can see it. Well, I guess I can see it on the screen. I'm going to show you some of the projects that we've recently done in South Florida. This one's on the New River.
Microphone.
I think you tied the microphone or not.
Oh, okay, here we go. Coming back. Is that working now?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a project we were doing on the New River. You can see the address there. And that is part of the sub area known as the Tequesta. Most of the sites I'm going to show you are associated with the Tequesta Indians. And you can see on the old map, I think it dates from 1870 something, We were working in that little orange square, and you can see there's an agricultural field there at one time in the 1870s. The question whether it was Seminole or whether it was a pioneer wasn't very clear at the time.
Can you share the dates of the photos?
I'm sorry.
The dates of the photos that you're showing, when the dig happened?
Oh, when the excavations occurred approximately 6 years ago, 5 years ago. And you're looking at a typical excavation unit, and you can see what looks like post holes in the bedrock. That's the limestone. And there on the right is a potsherd. And that particular potsherd has a name. It's called St. John's check stamp. Now, the importance of these names is that archaeologists use these names almost like looking at cars from different years and different models of make. So we know that particular pottery dates from about 1200 AD to the time of European contact. And this is one of the ways we date a site. And here's another example of it, not quite as sharply defined. All of this from the same site.
How does the mound found there relate to the mound people in Mississippi?
Well, I'll talk about that.
Oh,
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
How deep were those shards from?
We were finding these pottery sherds about roughly a foot below the surface, so not particularly deep.
Near the river?
Near the river, yeah. And in this slide on the left, you see what's called socketed bone points. So keep in mind, there's no hard stone in South Florida. There's no flint, there's no basalt. So you think of the arrowheads. Well, they didn't have the materials normally to make arrowheads, so they would make their arrows out of bone, and they would actually sharpen the bone, and they could use these for fishing, for killing even a deer. And on the right, another type of tool, limestone net weight, because fishing was a very, very important part of subsistence. The left side is the incised bone pins, and these were hair pins, and they were beautifully carved, mostly made out of deer bone. And again, the whole issue with an axe, like getting an axe, I mean, there's no Home Depot around. What do? You have to make your axes, but there's no hard stone. So they were making their axes out of conch shells, out of the lips of conch shells, and you see it in the middle. And you can see the blade on the top. We've actually used these, the ones that are well preserved. You can actually cut trees with it. They would make canoes. Everything they had to do with woodworking, they could do with these tools, both the shell axes, but also using, of all things, shark's teeth, you'll see. And the leguous tree snail is important because it gives us an environmental indicator of the environment of that time, which in this case indicates that there were smooth bark trees growing at this place at one time, because that's the kind of trees that these snails need. Now, I said earlier that arrowheads are rare, but interestingly enough, we found 5 of these arrowheads from different parts of Florida or from different parts of the Southeast, dating back at least 500 to 1,000 years, made out of chert, kind of a flint-like material. So these were gotten through trade, likely. And then on the right, a plummet made out of lead. We're not sure of the age because we've discovered now that the Tequesta actually had galena that they were getting by way of trade from Missouri in the Midwest. We're not sure if it's from European contact or from the trade.
What is a chert? Is that a type of stone?
It's a stone, very similar to flint. When you think of flint, it's very similar to that.
That's not from around here though, that stone.
That's right. No, it's not from here. So you got to go to Central Florida is the nearest places.
I have a question over here, Bob.
Yeah.
Bob, question over here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, what's a plummet?
Can you repeat that?
What's a plummet?
Oh, a plummet. Good question. Let's see what we can do here. So a plummet, you can see there's a place for tying a cordage or a line. So a plummet could have a lot of functions. It could be like a weight for fishing, but some people think that they actually were ornaments that they were wearing. There's drawings from the 16th century with what looks like plummets are hanging from the belt of some of the Indians, particularly from the males. It's a good question, though.
Well, it wasn't like a plumb bob, right?
Well, no, that's what it looks like. You know, one of the things you got to be careful with in archaeology, we assert or assume function based on what we know. And sometimes it's hard to imagine that even though it looks like something, it doesn't mean it is what we think it could be.
It's going to be used for sounding depths.
Well, they did, Europeans were using it, so we do have lead sounding weights. But I don't think that the Indians were concerned about that. They were in canoes and just looking over the top. Now, you see one of those arrowheads or chert points. Now going back to the other one. And on the left is a catlinite bead. A catlinite is a stone that comes from another part of the United States, I think up in actually New York area. So it's really amazing that it ended up in Fort Lauderdale. And I put this in here and it makes me think of how old are you? Okay, so this boy, Evelyn, it was actually 10 years old at the time. And he went to our spoil pile as a volunteer and he actually found one of those arrowheads in the spoil pile. That's the dirt that we've already looked through. And he found it, and it was very embarrassing for the archaeologist working on this kid. I thought he had to be immortalized for doing that. And he wrote, "I am a kid." I like that. That's great. Now, before I talk about Palm Beach Island, what I didn't do is sort of jumped into Tequesta land by looking at this one particular site, but to give you a broader picture. So the Tequesta are the people who predated the Seminoles and Miccosukees. And the Tequesta are the people that occupied that part of southeastern Florida that extended from present-day Boca Raton Inlet, southward all the way through the Keys, through Key West. That was not Calusa land like the popular mythology that's been created. And then westward through the Everglades. And the principal town was the mouth of the Miami River, the town of Tequesta, as described by the first European colonists and settlers. Particularly, we know from the archival records that likely Ponce de Leon probably anchored somewhere off the Miami River on Biscayne Bay in 1513, even though we don't have the narrative, the log, Ponce de Leon's log disappeared hundreds of years ago because there was a Herrera who was the official historian for the King of Spain, and he was charged, I think in 1542, to write a history of the Indies in terms of the Spanish conquest. And all these archival documents were turned over to him, including that log apparently, and it disappeared. It was never seen again. So there's a guy you want to take his library card back. But there are references and there are maps created, and the map refers to a village at the mouth of the river called Tequesta, which is with a C, not with a T. And you realize that these Indian names that we bandy about are really phonetic spellings. At the Spanish are hearing Tequesta, became a C, then it became a T. And we don't know what happened in 1513, but we do know that the Tequesta were really not happy with the Spaniards. That somebody did not do very good PR, because if you were a Spaniard in the early 1500s and you were shipwrecked, and there were a lot of shipwrecks going on at that time, your lifespan as a Spaniard shipwrecked off of Miami or the Florida Keys was anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, because you would be killed very quickly, with the exception of some of the children and some of the women who were taken captive. One of those prisoners, a 13-year-old boy, was Fontaneda Escalante, Escalante de Fontaneda, who was shipwrecked in the early 1500s off the Keys. He was taken prisoner, and he was allowed to live with the Indians. He started growing up with them. He could speak their tongue. He's learned the languages. And we know all about Escalante because in 1567, Pedro Menendez, who is the founder of St. Augustine in 1565, had the mission of trying to create missions and settlements throughout Florida, particularly South Florida, where all of the shipwrecks were occurring. Because if you could create an allied relationship with the Calusa and the Tequesta, and the Calusa, by the way, were on the west coast of Florida, then you could protect those people, and therefore, you could have a way of knowing that the shipwrecks would be protected, and you would be able to go and retrieve these people. Even better if you could leave a Spanish outpost, a fort, a mission, and this is part of the plan that Menendez had. to create a settlement at the mouth of the river, as well as one at the capital of the Calusa near present-day Fort Myers. And so that is what he proceeded to do, Menendez. And with tremendous energy, he was actually able to convince the Tequesta, after all this warfare, to create a coexistence. Of course, the coexistence wasn't out of goodwill. It was because the Spanish had things that were really interesting. They had things made out of metal. They had armor. They had different kinds of weapons, and maybe more importantly, they had rum. That should resonate with you. And lots of rum. And keep in mind, indigenous people have never experienced liquor in terms of the Western version. They had their own versions of things, but this was different. This was different. And this was the beginning of the end for the Tequesta and all native people of the New World that were encountered by Europeans, because between Columbus's landing in 1492 up until the 19th century, I mean, really, it was the American Holocaust. Millions of indigenous people were killed, enslaved, reduced, marginalized, their lands taken from them. I mean, we have to not necessarily take the blame because we didn't do it, but we at least need to have the consciousness to know of what happened and how we can provide the respect and the regard that I think is important, not only to the living descendants, but also to the archaeology in terms of the sites itself. Because when I was a boy, as I told you, the Tequesta had only a placard at the library, in front of the library at Biscayne Park, and there were books and journals, and only really a handful of people even knew who the Tequesta were. You had to be a historian or an archaeologist at the University of Florida. Nobody in the city of Miami knew who the Tequesta were unless they read that plaque. So I feel that what the archaeology has done to date in recent years in the city of Miami and throughout South Florida has given a voice and created a narrative for these lost people, for their culture that has been so shattered. And the Tequesta end up in the 16th century being colonized. And that colony, by the way, didn't last very long. There were a lot of misunderstandings. The people who were doing the colonizing, it included a church, Spanish mission, and a fort. And you can imagine they didn't really have a high regard for these native people. For the church, it was a matter of converting them. And because if you could convert them, then of course you're saving their soul, but you're also, again, creating a relationship that is important, because part of the reason for this colonizing not just rescuing shipwreck victims, but was the idea that you were creating a bulwark, a defense line against the expanding British coming out of Georgia and the French. And if you had these Indian allies, then you could be more assured that you could maintain Florida as a Spanish province, as a Spanish colony. And that was the plan, and that was the intent. And so how do you create these alliances? So again, with Menendez, you trade, you provide goods, you provide ways of understanding, which usually ended up with misunderstandings. But from the standpoint of the Calusa and the Tequesta, who were actually much more advanced than the Spanish could acknowledge, because the Spanish would meet them and say, well, these people are heathens. They don't even practice agriculture. They have no corn. They're not growing anything. All they do is wander around. They go fishing. I mean, these are not civilized people. And we are doing them a favor because we are bringing them into a state of consciousness, a state of, elevating them by introducing agriculture so they can grow corn. And that way, when a Spanish ship lands here, they'll have pigs and they'll have food. They'll have things that we can use. So these introductions did not go well with the South Florida Indians. And I'll tell you why, because they didn't need them. There were such plentiful resources with the marine animals, there were monk seals, there were whales, porpoises, fish, deer, everything you can imagine in the palette that was available. They didn't have to use agriculture to develop as a society. And in fact, what happened is they created a very highly structured, stratified society with a cacique, which was the king, the top of the list, a shaman, different levels of elitism, including the warriors, and the warriors, like, for example, wouldn't have to do any work. So they had all of this worked out very much like you would see in Europe or the Middle East or other parts of the world. And the Spanish didn't understand that even their cosmology was highly advanced. If you were a Tequesta Indian, according to a Spanish priest, they believed that you had three souls, one in your eye, which some people will know that reflects Egyptian ideas. The second was your shadow, and you can think of Peter Pan with your shadow. And the third, which was the most important, was the reflection. Your reflection in the water was the third soul. Why was that important? Number one, you have to understand they didn't have any mirrors. No one ever saw what they looked like, except when they looked in the water. And they didn't think they were looking at themselves. They thought they were looking at their soul. That becomes an instrumental foundation for understanding the mortuary beliefs of the Tequesta and all of the Indians of Florida, because they believed that upon death, that you would be taken into the waterland, that heaven was this waterland, this incredible place filled with fish where your canoes would go and everything you needed was there in the water. So the water was the portal to the afterlife. So when you died, they would take your body, in many cases, and they would lay it on the beach or on the banks of the Miami River or any water body, a pond or a lake. And the reason was, well, there's two reasons. First was they believed that you would decay in a natural way. That desiccation would be as a result, of course, of things like crabs and buzzards. And so, of course, a buzzard was sacred. I mean, you didn't kill a buzzard, not that most people want to kill a buzzard anyway, but they believed everything was connected. All the animals, all the plants, everything was a continuum universe. There was no distinction between natural and supernatural the way we do it. No distinction in the way we think of this demarcation in such a sharp way between life and death, because all of this was a continuum. So dying meant being prepared and going into this next existence, into this waterland. And so there they would lay the bodies out. So different is that idea from our ideas growing up as Westerners, that when the Spanish first arrived in Key West, they called it Cayo Hueso, which means bone key, because when they saw the beaches, they saw the bones of people distributed along the beaches. They said, "Oh man, these people, they're savages." I think they're cannibals. I don't even want to land there. I don't. The heck with Margaritaville. I'm not staying here. I'm leaving. So Cayo Hueso became changed to Key West because in the English maps, Hueso, West, and it is a Western key. And I'm not saying for sure that's the reason, but that's my speculation is how it got changed. Complete lack of understanding of what anything and everything meant. There was even a time in the 16th century that to kill an indigenous person, to kill an Indian, there was a debate with the Vatican as to whether it was a sin, And because the discussion was an Indian a human being? That was, you can't even believe that today, but that's exactly how some of the thinking was. There were a handful of priests who stuck up for indigenous people, said, yes, they are human beings, and we need to help them, we need to protect them, because there were a lot of the conquistadors with the charters that were issued by the Spanish. You would get, Columbus didn't just get Cuba and the Bahamas and all the land, he got the people, he got to own the people. They were immediately deeded to him by the King of Spain as slaves, and they used those slaves. They depopulated the Bahamas between 1492 to 1515, taking all of the Bahamian Wakayans that didn't die from disease, that weren't killed, and took most of them to first Cuba and then to Venezuela to die for pearls because they were masterful divers, and they would dive them to death until they couldn't, their lungs would collapse. So many people were killed, and it was those priests who vouched for the humanity that the Vatican finally stated that they are human beings. And again, I'm kind of paraphrasing this. I'm not giving you the specific details, but I'm giving you a sense of these important events because it lays the groundwork for understanding what's happened in Florida and why we're at where we're at this point in time. So with all of that, with Menendez making this effort for a failed colony, I think within a year, the colony collapsed because of rebellion, so-called rebellion. Well, it didn't help that the priest and the soldiers went up to the Indian mounds, the elevated mounds where the dead were buried, and started tearing down what they call the wooden items, the totems, and burning them and smashing them in front of the native people. That immediately created a civil strife. That kind of insensitivity just didn't work. So they had to abandon Miami. And eventually there was another mission attempt in 1743, San Ignacio, also on the north side of the Miami River, which also failed for some of the same reasons. But interestingly enough, by the year 1700, the relationships between the Spanish and the Tequesta and the Clusa had greatly improved. They were definitely allies, and your life expectancy as a Spaniard went considerably up if you landed in South Florida. And if you were an Englishman, or your life expectancy wasn't so good because the Spanish were always at war with the English. So much so that if you read Jonathan Dickinson's journal of survival of shipwreck near Jupiter, Florida in 1696, you discover that he was working extremely hard to speak to the Indians with a Spanish accent. And they were very suspicious, very suspicious. But he did manage to get a safe passage eventually to St. Augustine by pretending that he was Spanish. So 1709, an important year because the English plantations in South Carolina and Georgia have a shortage of labor. The beginnings of what would become the African influx of slaves was preceded by indigenous people being slaves on those plantations. And what they did was they didn't have enough people, enough Indians. And so they used their allies, which were Indians from Georgia called the Yamasee and Yuchi from North Florida. And they started launching slave raids into Florida, including South Florida. And these slave raids actually started capturing families and bringing them up to South Carolina to work on rice and indigo plantations. And by between 1709 and 1763, these raids had so depopulated the Indians that many of the people at Tequesta and Clusa began petitioning the Spanish, particularly the governor of Cuba, to allow them to immigrate to Cuba because they were trying to get away from these raids. And they all clustered in Key West, the last island. They couldn't get any further away from these raiders that eventually they were picked up and taken to Cuba, where they were put into, I wouldn't use the word reservations, but Indian towns. And one of them was Guanamacoa outside of Havana, beginning in 1709 through 1743, 1763. So I'm giving you a very quick summary of the rise and the fall of the Tequesta in terms of that as a society and how this impact to them was so monumental that we have created, as a result of all this, a society that essentially culturally is extinct and eventually was taken over by the Seminoles and Miccosukes who were occupying empty land. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, as a result, or despite that, are there any remnants of the Tequesta and Calusa language?
It's a great question. Is there any remnants? So that's an interesting debate. The Seminoles and Miccosukes for a long time, when archaeology was going on in South Florida, it showed no interest in the human remains because he said these are different people. But that thinking has changed in the last 10 years, and they claim that there is some descent, that there are some Tequesta and Calusa that stayed behind, that hid in the Everglades or came back from Cuba. And there's one family in particular that they point out lived out in the Everglades that was supposedly one of these remnant Calusa and Tequesta families. So that has changed.
So there might be some living Tequesta and Calusa.
Well, in terms of DNA, what the percentage is,
Sure.
yes, I think so. And there probably is a lot of them in Cuba, in fact.
With the Taino?
Well, the Taino was the Indians in Cuba and Hispaniola, but they in Cuba became this sort of dropping off point of indigenous resettlement from Central America and from Florida, from the Bahamas. So a lot of the different groups ended up in Cuba. Yes, go ahead.
I've read some Spanish accounts of child sacrifice for the Tequesta, and I was wondering if there's like any archaeological evidence that's been found to support that, or if that's sort of
Well, I think the account, this is one of the things that put off the Spanish. They saw that the Tequesta and the Calusa were very quick to kill some of their children as sacrifices. But remember, these kind of sacrifices of children is also accounted in the Bible. I mean, it's not just indigenous people who were doing this, because there was a belief system that when you needed something, if you wanted to stop a hurricane from approaching or whatever it might be, that you had to make a sacrifice to the gods. And what do? You don't give him, you don't give him the stray dog. You give him the most valuable thing. You had to, the most valuable thing are your children, and that's what was surrendered. So that was something that the Spanish priests, if understandably, did not like. It couldn't handle. But archaeologically, we don't see necessarily the evidence of what would be a sacrifice isn't necessarily very clear. But we have seen knives made out of human bones, probably, that were used for such things. Yeah.
I saw this archaeological program. It was a series of a guy who would go around the country, and one of the series was that they found evidence of a Maya mounds up in the Georgia area, and this guy was sort of suggesting that perhaps there's a lot of names like Miami. It's like a Maya, the word Maya in Miami. And is there any truth to this, or this is
One of the questions I get all the time is there a Mayan connection? And as a young guy, I certainly was interested in that. I thought that was pretty exciting. So I spent my career looking at the evidence, and I've discovered that evidence of Mayan or Central American influence is minimal at best. There is very little to indicate that there was, for example, any migrations of people there. And I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm saying that the evidence isn't there. We have found a few Central American pieces of pottery and different kinds of artifacts in South Florida. But what makes it difficult to interpret is that the Spanish were also accumulating those things from those areas, and they had them on their ships, bringing them back as souvenirs. And at a shipwreck, they ended up in South Florida. So, at the mouth of the Miami River, excavations done on the north side, we found Mayan pottery. We found things, but they were right with Spanish pottery. So they were utilizing Aztec and different kinds of bowls as part of their, settling in Mexico, for example. So I think it's just much more complicated than you would think. Just finding the artifact in itself is not conclusive. And I would say the same would be true with any mounds in Georgia or any place else. But I mean, I think there were a lot more influences going on. But the question archaeologists ask isn't so much whether there could have been contact between one culture and another, but rather what was the effects of that contact. If it didn't have any effect, then it becomes just this little small point in time in history. So if a canoe filled with Mayans ended up getting blown onto the Florida Gulf Coast, and those people were assimilated into the local tribe and had no effect on anything in terms of that culture, well, I mean, it is interesting, but it's not important in a cultural archaeological way. That makes sense.
Did they have a monetary system, like coins that were shells as coins or anything?
Well, again, coins are a very Western idea. That's what we do.
Right.
But trade, I mean, the idea of
I was
coins
going to
is
ask you
trade.
about the trade. How did they find out the trade routes?
Yeah, so the trade, and I'm going to show you some slides about some of that, but the trade was things that people needed are things that people thought was really significant. So one of the most surprising things we found at the mouth of the Miami River, the Miami Circle, for example, is we found copper from Illinois, galena from Missouri, basalt, a stone from the Appalachians, mica, quartz. I mean, we're hundreds, not thousands of miles away from those things. And these things that ended up down here in the form of ornaments, or in the case of basalt, is beautiful axes. So these things are important, but they have a value more than the functionalities. They represent status, and they represent something extraordinary in terms of quartz. I mean, quartz is a beautiful stone, and believed that it had power. Everything had power. Everything had a type of soulfulness that you had to do a prayer. You had to, when you killed a deer, you had to thank the deer. You would take part of the deer after you killed it and butchered it, and you would bury it. The same with the sharks. They would take parts of the shark and they would actually bury it in the ground as an offering. Everything, it was filled with respect and regard for nature and for the world, for the greater world. This is a connection all of us, many of us have lost, where we just go about our secular lives, and our religiosity might be, say, for Saturday or Sunday, for whatever our beliefs are. But in their lives, in their world, everything was intimately connected and respected.
Were some of the Indians, like the Nipissing up by the Great Lakes, were they considered sorcerers?
Oh, yeah, shamans,
other ones?
absolutely. Yeah, they definitely, I mean, I could tell you.
I mean, one tribe would say, oh, they're into witchcraft.
Well, they were all into witchcraft. They all had shamans.
Yeah,
Yeah, they all had
okay.
their specialists
I
who was
see.
not just a healing doctor, but who's someone who could see the future, who could see things, solve mysteries and so forth. That was common. But there was also misunderstandings. I talked earlier about how the Spanish perceived indigenous people. Well, it's a two-way street. An indigenous person, a Florida Indian, didn't necessarily like the Florida Indians that lived on the other side of Florida. And they would kill them just as readily in many cases. And the only way you could get around the dynamics of how people, it's always us and them. The idea of themness is a defining quality of humanity. We're always looking for ways to make ourselves different than the people across the street. Always different. Our high school is not that high school. That's why we're defeating them in a football game. That's why we throw rocks at them when they wear those shirts. I mean, that's part of the essence of our problems and challenges in life. And I don't mean to, wax philosophically about it, but it's that idea of creating these distinctions. And what I've learned, and I'm sure most of you have learned as we get older, hey, you know what? We're all the same. We're the same in terms of our aspirations. We may look different. We may have different religions. We love our children the same way. We have the same needs. We're so much more similar than we are dissimilar. And so much of our world has evolved in spotting differences and creating these distinctive levels based on skin color, based on where you're from. And the more you travel, the more you get to know people and say, wow, person's just like me. And with that said, you know what? There's a lot of really stupid people in the world. And it can be from any group. I've met indigenous people and I thought, well, gee, this guy, I might as well be working at Walmart. Some of the stuff I've heard. But, go ahead.
You also have to be careful because you have only one side here. The Indian didn't write stuff, they didn't wrote what they're doing. So if someone says, oh, he's doing a witchcraft, you don't
It's
know.
not witchcraft.
You feel like, oh my God, what is he doing?
Exactly,
Like
sure.
you don't have reading in both sides to know.
Yeah. I mean, we are look, I hate to say it this way, but we are the victors and we get to write the history. We wrote the history. We created the narrative. We went to school and read that narrative. We believe. And as a kid, I remember when I'm reading the history book in middle school, the first settlers in the United States were Jamestown and then the Pilgrims. Well, wait a minute, what happened to the Spanish in St. Augustine? Isn't Florida part of the United States? But we all grew up with this misleading kinds of information. And I think we have a responsibility to ourselves, to our children, to our grandchildren, to set the record straight. It's not about reparations. It's about correcting the truth. And by looking at the truth from the way it is, complicated and multifaceted and with empathy. Palm Beach, I'm now getting back to the sites on Palm Beach Island. It's a barrier island. These barrier islands were very attractive. This is a site we worked on at that address, 1470, 1480 North Lake Way. And as you know, to live in Palm Beach, doing archaeology there is a bit of a privilege because it's very hard to even park your car on the island because they don't have anybody there. So we did our work. We found what you would expect, a lot of interesting shell species, which is important for reconstructing the kinds of environments that were being exploited. This is a cross section of a typical profile showing all the disturbances from modern development, but then the brown areas below are intact areas of intact prehistoric materials that we refer to as middens, which is essentially where people were living and just throwing their garbage onto the
Middens?
middens. They use the word midden, M-I-D-D-E-N. These are some of the artifacts found, again, on the left of pottery sherds, and you see that really interesting chevron design, shell beads in the middle, and coconut shells, because why would you have coconuts? Because coconuts do not exist in the New World, that is in North and South America. And the first coconut, according to the coconuts actually came from Southeast Asia, from the Philippines. So it's the Spanish who brought coconuts to North and South America, because the Spanish had colonized the Philippines very early, and they were bringing them by way of Mexico, crossing Mexico. And then I think the first recorded coconuts grown in the New World were in Trinidad in 1521, something like that. So I was collecting the coconut, trying to figure out when it was introduced into Florida. And we're still looking at radiocarbon dates. We don't have a complete answer yet. This is one of those chert projectile points, a knife that was hafted for cutting. That came from that site. There's a bone dagger. It's made from a long bone. A bone awl, which is a tool for puncturing or for even as a possible needle. A sandstone abrader to the left, which is for grinding and making these axes out of shell. And on the right, fossil bone, probably a manatee bone that was recovered from some place like Peace River. This is really some of the more incredible artifacts that we found.
Huh.
On the left is the head of an owl made out of pottery. This was found at the mouth of the Miami River, and it shows the importance of animals. When you find what you and I think of as art pieces, they weren't doing this for art. They were doing this because it's part of their cosmology, like most indigenous people. And the owl is a very important animal in terms of a central creature that has a tremendous spiritual meaning. On the right, in far contrast to this Palm Beach site, that is a terracotta head of a Mongolian doctor that was found in an Indian mound in Palm Beach. Now, it goes back to the question, this dates back at least 12 to 1400 AD. How did it get to Palm Beach? I mean, is it true that when the Chinese keep claiming they discovered America, is this, I mean, if the guy who wrote that book saw this, he definitely would put a picture of this in his book. But it's not so simple. And that is because, again, the Spanish brought things from all over. And you have to, when you're doing real science, you have to eliminate the simplest and most obvious explanation before you go to UFOs and other things.
That's the answer. Sorry.
Now we're here in familiar territory. 444 Brickell, this is the site we've been working at. And you can see its location on the map on the right. It's north is up, and the yellow square polygon is where we've been working. That's what it looked like in the 1950s. You see, it was a vacant lot. It's very close to when I saw it as a boy. Now, I don't know if it's lost on any of you that the place I saw when I was 13 years old and dug in is the place I'm digging in now. So amazingly enough, I actually am back where I was, and actually in the very hole that we had dug in one place, actually redug and found some of the same things that we had found when we were 13.
So where was that Model T?
The Model T is gone. I don't know what they do with it.
That map.
Oh, it was over on the right, closer to the bridge.
Close to the arrow.
Yeah, very, very close to, well, actually, for you fans of, yeah, right with the arrows, that's exactly.
How often are you working with paleontologists so you find out that animals that were existent then are not now? And all that?
Well, what the great thing about archaeology is you can have any specialty that you're interested in. So if you're interested in animals, you have what they call zooarchaeologists, and they look at animal bones, they reconstruct the environment and changes in the species. If you're interested in the plants, they have ethnobotanists. We have an ethnobotanist working with us. She's looking at, we found thousands of seeds, including apparent cultivars, things that have been cultivated. And so we're having one of the first glimpses of what plants were being exploited by the Tequesta because of the extraordinary preservation there. So anything you're interested in human life, you can, that has a material equivalent, you can actually look for and work and analyze. So here we are doing our excavations. Look at on the left is the bedrock. After we remove the soils, we're left with a rock, and you can see it's like a moonscape in the middle. You can see we're working deep in crevices up to 1.5 meters, 2 meters deep in some places, having to use pumps. And there on the right, you see that we made a major discovery in one of those holes. That's a whale rib. Very little in the way of whale remains have ever been found. And yet we know from the Spanish that whales were very important. Whales were exploited in terms of obviously there's a lot of meat, but the reason you archaeologists don't find whales when they look at the sites is who's going to drag a whale back to their village? So all the butchering happens on the beach, and that's where all of the work is done there, and all the bones are left there, unless there are certain bones that you're interested in. In this case, the rib was the bone that they brought back and used as a offering, burying it in one of the solution holes.
Was that actually like that, or does it look like that because it's all dug out on the
It's
left?
because it's dug out, so it had soil when the Indians were there.
Okay, but
They likely were.
the rocks were like that, and he just dug out the soil?
Yeah.
But the rocks were shaped like that.
That's correct. Yeah, it's
Wow,
natural.
okay. Huh.
So here was the big discovery. We're excavating and we find a place where the soils are really deep in one of those holes, and there are preserved wooden artifacts, some of the few ever found in southern Florida. Some were found on Marco Island in the 1890s, but these were
Petrified wood.
wooden fire starters. And this was an incredible discovery that had never been found before, but it answered one of the mysteries. So when we're excavating these Tequesta sites at the mouth of the Miami River, cooking was an important part of what people were doing. But we weren't finding the fire pits. We weren't finding hearths. We found some, but not as many as you would think. And we said, why is that? And finally, we speculated, our hypothesis is that they were using fireboxes. So they were, the houses were actually not on the ground level, but actually elevated on stilts, like driving through Key Largo, and you see all the houses are elevated because of the flooding. And there near the river where they had seasonal flooding during the rainy season, the houses were elevated, and they were cooking on those wooden platforms by using fireboxes. And then what they would do is they would dump the ashes over the side of the scaffolding, and that's why we're finding all the charcoal, but no pits because of that. Wooden pestle cordage actually preserved. And by the way, we dated this level. It's 1,700 years old.
The cordage or the pestle?
The cordage is like for nets, for netting.
No.
They were
But the age?
The age of.
1,700 years old. Some of the oldest organic. Yes, go ahead.
So how confident is radioactive carbon dating? I mean,
Well,
it's-
Well, statistically, it would be in the 90% certainty. And the radiocarbon dates we got from the Brickell site, the artifacts and the radiocarbon dates indicate occupation from about circa 500 BC to Spanish colonial times, and then subsequent homestead in the 19th century. We did find artifacts that were 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 years old. But at this point, it seems as if they might have been artifacts picked up from other places, or perhaps dredged during the widening of the river. That might have been where there was an old site very close to the river and now got redeposited. That's one of the contentions of one of the archaeologists from UN. Yeah.
Well, you had a question with somebody online, they were asking, is this the site that's in the news now?
Yes, this is the same site. So you asked about seeds. On the left, you see one of the seeds that have been uncovered of the thousands, were all well preserved. But the biggest discovery is the mosquito. We found the first preserved mosquito ever found at 1,700 years old. And we're trying to get it identified. If it's a
Walter, is that-
female mosquito, there could be blood in that mosquito. It could be a very interesting analog for a good science fiction story.
Yes.
Michael Crichton.
These are plummets that the young man was asking about earlier, made out of shell, made out of stone. That stone is from the Appalachian Mountains. It's not from down here, but these plummets obviously were important because a lot of work went into making them.
Is there any such usage as like radioactive calcium or magnesium or anything like that?
Well,
Or
not
is it
that
only-
I know of.
Yeah, okay.
Not anybody.
It's just radiocarbon so far?
Oh, you mean in terms of dating? Yeah,
Yes,
that's the
yes.
main. There's different radioactive dating techniques, but
Okay,
radiocarbon is the most commonly used because it's the least expensive and it has a long track history of use now. Yes.
Do you know what the material was that they used for the fireboxes?
You mean what they were burning?
Know what they were using to contain the burn?
Oh, I don't know. We haven't found a firebox. That's why I say it's hypothetical, but that's what they were
Probably
using.
stone, I imagine, something that wouldn't burn.
Well, to my surprise, you could do it in certain, like a hardwood, you could do it. And it wouldn't necessarily burn the wood, especially if you charred the wood surface first, you could actually have a fire without it igniting anything.
so that's not petrified wood, none of the wood. you found.
No, Florida has lignite, it has ironwood, it has all these really good hardwoods that would be good candidates. I'm sure there were woods you wouldn't want to use, but again, I'm no expert on what those woods might be. And my idea is one that's hasn't been proven. It's just a matter of observation, speculation. Well, getting to the historic period, on the right, the bottle seal is from, I believe that was a cognac bottle from the 1850s. But we found a lot of historic artifacts, including some from the Spanish period, like olive jar sherds, and a lot of things from this 1830s to 1850s house site. I think the records indicate it was a Robert Fletcher who had the homestead there. This is before the Brickles acquired the land. Does that name ring a bell? Yeah. Now, the Phoenix button is on the left. The Phoenix button, has anybody been to downtown and been to the Whole Foods restaurant? You know where that is? That was part of the town of Tequesta, and under the Whole Foods restaurant, and the prehistoric wise, was the cemetery that Tequesta, the only one we know about, aside from the mounds that were destroyed. The cemetery were in these large solution holes. You were asking about those dips. This was about half the size of this room, of this part of the room, and it was filled with Tequesta dead. There were 500 individuals buried in what they call secondary burials, all under the Whole Foods restaurant. Yeah.
That was where the Royal Palm.
That's where the what?
Royal Palm Hotel stood.
Yes, very close to it. In fact, when we were doing our work there, we uncovered one of the steps of the Royal Palm Hotel, and it literally maybe not even a foot from the step of the Royal Palm Hotel were 3 human skulls.
Wow.
Skulls broken right there. So there was so much, and this button has a story to tell. It's one of the great finds we made. Does anybody know what a Phoenix button is? The Phoenix button is a button that was made for the Haitian army in 1820, 22, something like that. The first president after the revolt against the French, the slave revolt, was Henry Christopher. Henry Christopher apparently was a very intelligent guy, and he was a skilled warrior and fighter in general. And in fact, he successfully defeated the French, and he was able to take over Haiti, or Hispaniola at that time, as a result of that slave rebellion. And he had a lot of really interesting tricks. One of them was is well written in the history books, is that when the French were laying siege to Cape Haton, which is a fortress, was a French fortress, but the the Haitian army had taken over, so but the French fleet, I think it was under Napoleon, had come back trying to lay siege to it and bombarding it. What Henry Christopher did was he opened the gates, and he didn't have very many soldiers, but he did have uniforms that I guess he had got from the French, and he put the uniforms on the soldiers that were in the fort, and I think there was like 40 or 50 or something. It wasn't a big number, and he started marching them, but it was the same soldiers. He kept marching the same ones, so because the French were counting what their army would be, and eventually the French left for whatever the reason was. But this was maybe the smartest thing that he ever did. This button, because this is the phoenix rising from the ashes, and this has the number 7. This is the 7th Regiment of the Haitian Army, and when you were creating your uniforms, of course, you had to have military buttons. So where do you get your buttons? There's no place in Haiti that's going to make them, or in the United States. They were made in Europe, and the biggest button maker was in England. So all of the European powers were ordering their buttons from there. Well, if you want to learn about your enemies, and even your adversaries or even your allies can be your enemies in Europe, what you do is you put a spy or intelligence into the button factory, because that way you can count how many buttons are they making. And what he did was he put in an order for all of the regiments that were up to 20 something. I mean, I forgot what a regiment was or what, but I mean, it was thousands. I mean, he had thousands of soldiers. All you had to do was look at these buttons that he ordered. And so, of course, the French knew about the button order. In the end, Henry Christopher didn't pay for this buttons. He made his point. He put in the order, got the information out to all the European armies so they could think twice about coming back to Haiti, and abandoned his order. And the button order, the maker was stuck with thousands and thousands and thousands of buttons. So what did he do? He sold them to a trader, an Indian trader in North America. So he ended up selling to a British guy who took them to Fort Vancouver in Washington State and Oregon by the thousands and used them as trade items with the Indians of that area. And many of the buttons ended up with finding their way to the East Coast, but most of them on the West Coast. This is the only one ever found in South Florida, maybe one of the only ones found in Florida. So I always love that story. It's one of the ones that will be in my book.
What's CM mean?
That's my last slide. So if there's any questions or comments, yes, go ahead.
I went to the park where my daughter lives, and I told them I was coming here to hear you. My granddaughter reminded me, there's a big park across from her house, and there's a sign on it that says that it is a Tequesta resting, a burial ground, which makes me wonder with what you're talking about on Brickell, not getting political, what do you, as an archaeologist, consider is a fair, equitable trade-off with these contractors who are buying land and then they're finding these artifacts on them? How do you?
Well, look, I ended up what I left out of my stories earlier was the last place that I worked after the state when I was in Tallahassee was for the National Park Service. And I participated in the Archaeological Survey of Everglades National Park and Big Cypress. And it was a great event. And it looked to me like I had this promising career with the National Park Service, which a lot of people would envy. And I know that I did, my boss there, my director offered me, I know it's a long way here, but my director offered me a contract for 2 years to be the archaeologist for Cumberland Gap in Tennessee. But at the same week, the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County created a archaeological program for the first time based on a state grant. And I was offered a position to be the county archaeologist of sorts for a 1-year contract for far less money than the 2-year contract. So, but I said, my heart's in Miami, I'm going to take the Miami position. And my director thought I was nuts doing that, but of course, I was happy to do it. But why I'm telling you that is because working there, for 2 years doing an inventory of all the sites in Miami and the county, on the eastern part of the county. I spent that time just literally chasing bulldozers, watching site after site after site being destroyed, completely destroyed. No protection, nothing. I was there during the rezoning of Brickell Avenue from those lovely, beautiful mansions till they upscaled them for the higher. I watched all the mansions being demolished, all the sites that were on that property being destroyed, one after another. Me and my colleagues, we drafted an ordinance. We didn't realize at the time that it was the first county ordinance in the United States, and what would be the second city ordinance in the United States with Miami to protect these sites. And the idea of protection is to find, in my opinion, that balance between preservation and development. And you can't, I said earlier in a presentation I did at the city, I mean, really, it's incredible. I was standing, coming back to Miami at 500 Brickell, and they were lifting up the sidewalk, and there was one of these Tequesta axes made out of shell just under the sidewalk. Thousands and thousands of people had walked over, and you realize Miami is the city of the living built on top of the city of the dead, just like Jerusalem, just like Paris, just like London. And so we have a debt to our past. We have a obligation to let our heritage be spoken and brought forth to our children, to our grandchildren. And Miami was completely negligent in that. Everything was in the past. Everything, if you saw anything, you'd see it in a museum. I read about it in a book. But the city had not preserved any of its legacy in any physical way. And that was going to change. Now, we couldn't save everything, and we didn't save everything, but we ended up documenting after that ordinance, site after site after site. We filled the museum with artifacts, with rich stories that could be told for hundreds of years from now. And the Brickell site is part of that continuum. And there are things that can be preserved, parts of sites. So what I would do is I did something in the ordinance that was different. It was that if you came in for a permit to build on this archaeological zone, you couldn't say no. And you say, well, what kind of ordinance is that? Can't say no. The reason we did that is because we knew that we would never get the ordinance passed through the commission if you were going to say, well, wait a minute, that's your land, but you can't build there. So sorry, you're not getting that permit. No, you could say yes. You always said yes, but with conditions. And it was the conditions that made the difference. The condition would be, wait a minute, move that structure over here by 25 feet. That area there should be preserved, build around it. And that was the latitude that gave us the flexibility to preserve at least some parts of Miami's past, which we have done, which we're going to continue to do. So the Brickell site is an opportunity to do some of that. The development had already been approved, but there's a river walk, there's going to be a corridor at least, and maybe more if we find things that are something that can be looked at by the public, like Met Square that has those two wonderful circles. So the answer is you got to find that balance between the two.
What was the year that you put that ordinance in?
1981.
That was the first.
The first, I didn't know it was the first, I learned later. And our ordinance became a model for other ordinances in Florida and other parts of the United States. Yes.
Yes, so you mentioned the two circles, and I know that there was obligation for them to do more than what they've done so far. Right now, I walk by and it's exposed. How do you hold the developers accountable, follow through on those exceptions? I know it's a policy question, not an archaeology.
Well, I mean, it's a public governmental question because who holds the reins is in that case is the city of Miami. The city of Miami regulates the permitting, and if they're going to give a permit for a certificate of occupancy before these obligations have been met for the developer, well, is that really a prudent thing to do? So the answer is government's responsibility. You can get angry at the developers. You can try to hold them accountable, but a developer is a citizen, a corporate citizen who has one objective, essentially, which is to make money, that's what they're doing. That's their business. That's what they do. So they're going to use whatever the existing laws are. They're going to bend it if they think they can get away with it, and they're going to build. So whose job is it to balance that out? Whose job is it to constrain that or to find a way for sites to be properly documented, and in some cases, at least partially preserved. It's the government, it's the city. It's the city that has that obligation, and that city and the county and government has to be held accountable. I mean, if the developer does the wrong thing and deliberately ignores what the rules are and just starts destroying places, which I've seen happen, by the way, that's a different story. But if they're following the rules and they get the permit, I mean, I can tell you the Miami Circle, when they were demolishing the Brickell apartments, do any of you remember the Brickell apartments?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm driving over the Brickell Bridge, there's an ordinance, and the building is coming down, and I'm thinking, wow, this is, I didn't know about this. Under the law, they're supposed to notify the archaeologists that they're going to demolish this so we can be there to look. So I drove down and I ended up finding the developer, Michael Bauman, very nice guy. And I said, Mr. Bauman, I said, you're on an archaeological zone here. You're supposed to have an archaeologist. He said, nobody told me. He said, yeah, go ahead and look. And I didn't quite understand what he was saying because I knew there was an ordinance. Well, it turned out he was right, that the city of Miami gave him the permits without any requirements, with none. And it was only because I drove into that parking lot and talked to him, and he said, yeah, go ahead, you can dig. I thought he was doing it because he knew he had an obligation to the ordinance. I didn't realize at the time that he had no permit was given to him. And so whose fault is that? It's not the ordinance, it's the people implementing the ordinance, the people who were the policy makers and the reviewers and the bureaucrats. So the problem with an ordinance, it's no better than how it's implemented. And you have to have strong leadership and a strong vision in those people who do that. And it varies and changes through time. Yes. Go ahead.
As I told you before the lecture, in Israel, you have to have permit to build. Whatever you build, even if it's a
Here, sorry.
even if it's a private house, or even a basement, garage, you need an archaeologist to come and check before you do it. And in some cases in Jerusalem, there is a house, it's a nice story. They dig the floor to build a new floor, and they found literally under their house part of a synagogue. And they can't tell them, okay, leave the house, but they had to pay, the person had to pay, it's not the government. They literally build a hole in a glass so people can come and see it. They had to keep it. You can't destroy things. Antiquity as well. Of course you can, but depends on what. But everywhere it's the law. If you build something without telling the Israeli Antiquity Authority, you can go to jail. Like if you destroy something in your own house, and you have to pay for it, by the way. The person that built, if there is an archaeological excavation, he needs to pay for it. And
Kind of like
some,
an asset.
yeah,
Kind
and
of like an asset,
well, he doesn't get money for it.
No.
If people come and watch his stuff, but there is a gallery, the guy that there's a famous Israeli guy that built a humongous house in Jaffa, and he had to put in his basement. It was like a lot of archaeologists find his basement is an excavation site. We kept it the way it was, and he just did it up, and you can move technically you can move whatever you want. Moza Bridge to go to Jerusalem moved, I don't know how much feet, sorry. It moved like 3 meters because there was part of the synagogue. So they moved the entire bridge to go to Jerusalem because they found synagogue, a part of the synagogue. So I don't know the case of Brickell. I'm not from Miami, but I feel like you can do, even in the lobby, something. Like you don't have to destroy.
Right, that's true.
Something.
So at Brickell, the fact is that the developers actually fully cooperated with the archaeologists and fully cooperated with the intent of the law, and has now made a commitment to not only donate the entire collection to an institution, but to interpret all of those things. So in that sense, I think the related group is showing has a sufficient moral compass to do the right thing. And I think we'll see something that comes out of it. Yes.
Is there any way that they would consider a display in context on site of some of those artifacts?
They're going to do that and it exhibits that. So that is part of the plan. They're going to have it in the building. They're going to have it on the Riverwalk. They'll have it in several different places. And they're going to connect the Riverwalk from there to the Miami Circle.
Oh.
So it'll be one continuum.
Are they planning to put any of these artifacts maybe at one point in a time capsule?
I never even thought of time capsules somebody else can find in the future, maybe. I mean, sure, why not? Yeah. Hey, one great thing about archaeology is we talk about the importance of the refuse of indigenous people, how you can learn so much. Future archaeologists will have no problem finding our garbage.
You're old enough to remember, we had several Seminole Indian villages.
Yeah.
One of them being just west of 17th Avenue, just off of 7th Street.
Musa Isle.
And then one of them, 27th Avenue, about 23rd
Oh, yeah.
Street, so forth. Were those sites of any consequence at all too?
Yeah, both Musa Isle and Pirates Cove were both also prehistoric sites. And were looked at before they were, well, not completely, but some archaeology was done. Yeah, they're all built over now. Yes.
The circular elements that you found on the coast, the north and the south side of the river.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any opportunities that you may find other circular elements, other sites here in Dade County, like the state and south, which is a large habitation?
Well, I think these circular structures that are preserved because the posts in many cases went into the bedrock, so you can see them, probably occurred throughout South Florida, but most of the time we're not preserved because the posts weren't deep enough to get to the rock. I'm sure there's other sites where they might be found and have been found. So I think it's possible.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah.
It just occurred to me, we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of saving Arch Creek. And it seems like the timeline you suggested that was your first assignment to go down to Miami. Nobody wanted to do it. That must have been very soon after it was saved by the state.
No, my first job with the state was to go to Arch Creek
Right.
and to do the excavations. They had already acquired the property,
Right.
but now I had to demonstrate that it had archaeological significance.
So you found the sluice
I found that, yeah, I did.
and I guess some of the material that's in the museum now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you haven't been to History Miami's exhibits, archaeology wise, they're really, really nice, worth the trip, even though it's downtown and you have a park and all that.
I think a lot of people in Miami haven't ever been to Arch Creek.
Yeah.
And maybe
it's
don't
another
know the
special
basics, that it's a natural arch bridge over a creek, which makes sense of why they call it that. But I can imagine that if you go back to the first people who lived here, it's like meet me at the arch was probably a pretty simple thing to say, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it was just inside the bay and in from the waterway from the Everglades. So it would have been a great place to meet and probably have like some festivities or something.
Someone told me it was the inspiration for McDonald's.
Yeah, right.
And a worthless ad here, sorts. This is a book I wrote. It's published by University of Florida Press. Just reprinted. It's available through Amazon or whatever. So if you're interested in really getting a more robust picture of the early Miami through its archaeology, you can order this book. It's just
It's a great book. I've read it. And you're working on a new book?
Working on a new book on 25 artifacts that tell the Miami story.
Okay.
Great.
Oh, so this was the teaser, 10 artifacts.
Did you ever
He's
know?
not giving away anything, is he?
No, nothing at all. So this is something I really enjoyed. This is a pictorial history of the Everglades. What I like about this, aside from the research using these images that I was able to find, is that everybody thinks about Everglades. They think about the park. Well, this is the real Everglades. It went up to 27th Avenue, went up to Lake Okeechobee. So it's a good.
Where did you get that? Where do you get that book?
You can get it right here.
You tell me.
No, you can't.
I've seen it, yeah.
And this is Everglades Journal, a very interesting book by a gentleman named John Fritchie. I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, I know, but I guess that's my job. John Fritchie is an uneducated bladesman. This gentleman, when I was the county archaeologist, came by my office. There's some other things that Debbie will take care of. I'm gonna tell you about John Fritchie because it's such a remarkable story. John Fritchie comes into my office. He's an older guy, probably my age. Back then, he seemed like he was ancient, I guess. So, and he comes into my office and he has a bag, like a Publix bag, really old, beaten up bag, and he's got papers in it. And I'm not there when he comes in. My assistant meets the guy, and John Fritchie tells him that he wants to talk to me because he's got all these papers about archaeology and the Seminoles. And the assistant kind of dispatches him and sends him on his way, and he kind of briefly mentions this guy came by. I don't know who he was. Seemed kind of like a homeless guy or something. And about 3 or 4 months later, the guy comes back, and I happen to be there. It's John Fritchie. And amazingly enough, I started listening to him, and he opens up this bag and he dumps it out on my table, and it's just scraps of paper. I mean, like, you know, as if you were in a jail or a concentration camp and you were trying to find a piece of paper to write on. All these different scraps of paper, and each one is this narrative about something that he's observed growing up in the Everglades, because his father was a farmer, what they call a truck farmer, and they would go from place to place to place to place. And he was a smart kid and very observant, and he was writing these accounts as he got older, like on these scraps of paper. And I started reading them, and they were remarkable, particularly as he was telling them. And that's what this book is. So I was so impressed with him that we were able to get an editor to work with him and compile. I mean, nobody really, I hate to say it, we weren't very good at advertising the book, so nobody even knows about it. But one of the things that came out of it, he says, you know, there's he called it, how did he refer to it? I think he called it the Spanish pot site, the Spanish something site. I didn't know what he was talking about. He said, well, you know, I love these old silly times, but I'm going to show you, I'm going to take you over there. And so where he takes me in the very early 1980s is where next to Joe Robbie Stadium is located. Right on the Broward line, there was a dairy right on that line. It's terrible. I can't quite think of the name of the dairy anymore.
Ives Dairy?
What's that?
Ives Dairy?
Not Ives. It was much smaller, but it was on the county line in Miramar.
Graham.
Right, with BobCarr.
No, it wasn't that one. But yeah, maybe I'll think of it. So he takes me there, and it's still a dairy owned by that same family. And then I said, well, when were you here, John? He said, oh, I was here in the 1940s. I go, okay. I mean, so you're going to show me? I'm going to show you a site. He goes, I'm going to show you a site. So he gets permission. He takes me on the property, and we go up on this beautiful elevated island. Turns out to be, as we do the research, turns out to be the first earliest recorded Seminole settlement in South Florida, Cheeto Tuskegee, from 1828. We didn't know that at the time. And we were walking around, and he was uneducated, but he had a eidetic memory, a visual memory. And he's walking with me, and he goes, oh, damn. He says, where's that rock? It's right over here. I go, what, you know, he could remember these details. That was amazing, because that was his environment. And that's how his intellect was formed, on these visual cues and things he was seeing. And as he's walking around, he's telling me what was there, these big pots, these big sugar pots from sugar cane. So he thought, and his father thought, that they were from the Spanish, but they weren't. They were from the Seminoles and from the white settlers that weren't as early. But it turned out to be a remarkable site.
They were
And-
boiling cane,
Yeah, making
cane syrup.
Yeah. So they probably had sugar cane grinders and all that. And well, the short version of my story is we started working there because a short time after that, the dairy sold the land to a developer. We did the archaeology. We proved that it was the first Seminole settlement in South Florida, and the state bought the property with the county. So now it's Broward County Park. So,
Hey, which one?
gosh, Debbie, do you remember the name of that?
Oh,
It's terrible.
Helpakitney something.
Come on, Andy.
Yeah, God, it's terrible. You're getting old, man.
But it's big when you got it turned into a park.
I think you're right.
Yeah,
Was it Puritan area?
no, it's a really small dairy, but it was preserved. And now I'll close this with one last story from John Fritchie. John said, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, he said, we were farming on the Cowacuchee Slough, which is in Collier County. And he said, right there on near the creek. And he said, all of a sudden, he said, we knew the Seminoles. We saw the Seminoles all the time, and I knew them. He said, we saw a canoe. Canoe started coming down right past us. And he said, I got up to wave at him. And my father grabbed me and he pulled me down. He said, why are you pulling me down? He says, those aren't Seminoles. He says, those are the Moon-eyed people. He said, what is that? He says, these are the people before Seminoles. And these people had no clothing, only a wooden dugout canoe, and they passed by, and that left a big impression on John. And that was going back to your story about the remnants. Well, it turns out there's a newspaper from 1920s, Miami News, that talks about a hunter going out into the Everglades in that area and killing a deer. And when he gets to the deer, after the deer falls some distance away, he finds an Indian cutting the meat with a stone blade, with nothing modern, who ran off into the sawgrass when he spun. It's a great story. So I think the answer is there were some remnant people. I want to thank all of you for coming and listening to this.